As a bet, they sent the infertile widow to a rancher, but she came back with a son. Margaret Sullivan stood at the window of her tiny room above Henderson's general store, watching the Sunday churchgoers stream past in their finest clothes. Not since the whispers had become too loud to ignore, not since the pitying glances had turned into something colder, something that felt like blame. It had been 3 years since her husband Robert died in that terrible logging accident up in the northern woods. 3 years of living alone in this cramped space that smelled of flour and cedar from the store below, but it was the 5 years before his death that people couldn't stop talking about. 5 years of marriage without a child. 5 years that had apparently proven, in the minds of nearly everyone in Cedar Falls, Montana, that something was fundamentally wrong with her. Margaret was only 28 years old, but some days she felt ancient. Her dark hair, which she kept pinned in a simple bun, had started showing threads of silver at the temples. Her hands, once soft, had grown rough from working in the store, unpacking crates and sweeping floors and counting pennies until her fingers cramped. She'd grown thin, too, eating simple meals alone in her room, saving every dollar she could from her modest wages. The town of Cedar Falls wasn't large, maybe 300 souls on a generous count, and that meant everyone knew everyone else's business. Margaret had grown up here, the youngest daughter of the school teacher and his wife. She'd been a happy girl once, full of dreams about the future. She'd married Robert Sullivan when she was 20, and everyone had celebrated the union. Robert came from one of the more prosperous families in town. His father owned the lumber mill, and Robert worked as a foreman, managing the crews that went into the mountains. For the first year, everything had seemed perfect. Robert was kind to her, they had a comfortable home, and Margaret had spent her days keeping house and visiting with the other young wives in town. But as the months passed and no pregnancy came, she began to notice the questions. Gentle at first, from her mother and Robert's mother. "Any news yet, dear?" they would ask with hopeful smiles. Margaret would shake her head, trying to smile back, trying not to let the disappointment show. By the second year, the questions had grown more pointed. Robert's sisters, Catherine and Helen, started making comments at family dinners. "Well, some women just aren't blessed with fertility," Catherine had said once, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "It's God's will, I suppose." Margaret had felt Robert stiffen beside her, had seen him open his mouth to defend her, but his mother had quickly changed the subject and the moment had passed. The third year brought doctor visits. The physician in Cedar Falls, old Dr. Morrison, had examined her with clinical detachment and declared that he could find nothing wrong, but perhaps she should try drinking certain teas, eating certain foods, praying more fervently. Margaret had done all of it. She'd drunk bitter herbal concoctions that made her stomach turn. She'd eaten foods she couldn't stand. She'd prayed until her knees ached from kneeling on the hard wooden floor of their bedroom. Nothing changed. By the fourth year, she could see the disappointment in Robert's eyes, though he never spoke of it directly. His family wasn't so kind. Catherine and Helen had stopped inviting her to their afternoon gatherings. At church socials, conversations would stop when she approached, then resume in hushed tones after she passed. She heard the word barren whispered more than once, saw the way other women touched their own pregnant bellies or pulled their children close when she walked by, as if infertility might be contagious. The fifth year had been the hardest. Robert had grown distant, spending longer hours at the mill, coming home exhausted and silent. Margaret had tried everything she could think of to bridge the gap between them, but something had broken that she didn't know how to fix. She wondered sometimes if he resented her, if he wished he'd married someone else, someone who could give him the children he clearly wanted. Then came the accident. A cable had snapped during the logging operation in the high country, and Robert had been struck by a falling timber. They'd brought his body back to town on a Friday afternoon, and Margaret's world had shattered completely. She'd grieved, truly grieved, despite everything. Robert had been her husband, her companion, and whatever distance had grown between them, she'd still loved him. But grief, she discovered, was a luxury she wasn't allowed. At the funeral, she'd overheard Catherine talking to a group of women near the cemetery gates. 5 years and not even a pregnancy to show for it, Catherine had said, her voice sharp with bitterness. My poor brother spent the best years of his life with nothing to show for it. No son to carry on his name, no daughter to remember him by. What kind of wife leaves a man with no legacy? Margaret had stood frozen behind a large oak tree, the words hitting her like physical blows. Helen's voice had joined in. Mother always said there was something not right about her. Too thin, too nervous. Some women just aren't built for bearing children. It's a shame Robert didn't realize it before he married her. That night, alone in the house she'd shared with Robert, Margaret had made a decision. She couldn't stay there, surrounded by his family's blame and the town's judgment. She'd sold the house. Robert's sisters had been furious. claiming she had no right to it, but the deed had been in both their names, and the law was clear. With the money, she'd paid off the few debts they'd had and put the rest in the bank. Then she'd taken the room above Henderson's general store and asked Mr. Henderson for work. That had been 3 years ago, and life had settled into a quiet, lonely routine. She worked 6 days a week in the store, helping customers, managing inventory, keeping the books. Mr. Henderson was a widower himself, a kind man in his 60s who asked no questions and offered no pity. He paid her fairly and left her alone, which was all she wanted. Her only real friend was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. Mrs. Chen had come to America from China as a young bride, following her husband who'd worked on the railroad. She'd outlived him by 20 years and had seen enough of life to have perspective that most people in Cedar Falls lacked. She and Margaret had tea together every Tuesday afternoon, and Mrs. Chen never asked about children or marriage or any of the things that made Margaret's chest tighten with old pain. "You are more than a vessel for babies, Mrs. Muse," Chen had told her once, pouring jasmine tea into delicate cups. "You have a good mind, good hands, good heart. That is enough. That is more than enough." Margaret clung to those words on the hard days, the days when she saw young mothers in the store with babies on their hips and felt the familiar ache of longing. She'd made peace with her life, or so she told herself. She had her work, her small room, her Tuesday teas with Mrs. Chen. She read books borrowed from the town's small library. She took walks in the early morning before the store opened, when the streets were empty and she didn't have to see the judgment in people's eyes. She told herself she was content. She told herself she didn't need anything more. But late at night, lying alone in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep around her, Margaret sometimes let herself imagine a different life. A life where she was wanted, where she belonged, where the past didn't follow her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She had no idea that everything was about to change, that a cruel joke would become the doorway to something she'd stopped letting herself hope for. As she stood at her window that Sunday morning watching the churchgoers pass, she couldn't have known that her former brothers-in-law were already plotting in the saloon down the street, making their callous wager, setting in motion events that would transform her life completely. All she knew was that this was her life now, small and quiet and safe from further hurt, and for now, that had to be enough. The autumn air had turned crisp, and Margaret pulled her shawl tighter as she made her evening delivery to Murphy's saloon. Mr. O. Henderson usually handled the liquor orders himself, but he'd caught a cold and asked Margaret to drop off the invoice for the monthly whiskey shipment. She didn't mind the errand, though she never felt comfortable near the saloon. The smell of tobacco and alcohol drifted out even before she reached the door, mixing with the sound of rough laughter and clinking glasses. She planned to slip in quickly, hand the envelope to Mr. Murphy behind the bar, and leave before anyone really noticed her. But as she pushed open the heavy wooden door, she immediately recognized the voices coming from the corner table. Her stomach dropped. Robert's brothers, James and William Sullivan, sat with 3 other men, cards scattered across the table between them, empty glasses reflecting the lamplight. Margaret kept her eyes down and moved quickly toward the bar, but James's voice cut through the smoky air, loud and already slurred with drink. "Well, well, if it isn't the saintly widow Sullivan," he called out, and the other men at the table turned to look. "Come to check on us sinners, have you?" Margaret handed the envelope to Mr. Murphy without a word, turning to leave, but William's voice stopped her. "Don't rush off, Margaret. We were just talking about you, as a matter of fact." There was something mean in his tone, something that made her skin prickle with warning. She should have left. She should have walked right out that door and back to her room. But something made her pause, some instinct that whatever they were saying about her, she deserved to hear it directly rather than as second-hand gossip. "We've been discussing your situation," James continued, leaning back in his chair with false casualness. "Living all alone above that store, no family, no prospects. It's been, 3 years now since Robert passed? You're not getting any younger, sister." Margaret's hands clenched around her shawl, but she kept her voice steady. "My situation is my own concern, James. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work in the morning." "That's exactly what we're talking about," William interjected, slapping his hand on the table. The other men were grinning now, sensing entertainment. "You work too hard for a woman alone. What you need is a husband, a home, someone to take care of you." One of the other men, a ranch hand named Pete, laughed. "Good luck finding someone willing to take on damaged goods. Everyone knows she couldn't give Robert a single child in 5 years of marriage." The words hit her like a slap, but Margaret forced herself to stand tall to keep her expression neutral even as heat flooded her cheeks. She'd heard worse whispered behind her back. Hearing it said to her face shouldn't hurt any more than it already did. James leaned forward, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. Now, Pete, that's not charitable. I'm sure there's some man out there desperate enough or old enough or lonely enough to take on our dear Margaret. He paused, then snapped his fingers as if struck by sudden inspiration. In fact, I just remembered something. There's a notice up at the post office. Some rancher up in the hill country, way out past Miller's Creek, looking for a housekeeper. Fellow named Brennan, I think. Widower running his place all alone. William caught on immediately, his face lighting up with malicious glee. Samuel Brennan? That's right. I heard about him. Keeps to himself, hardly ever comes to town. Must be desperate for help if he's advertising for it. He looked at Margaret with mock concern. That might be just the thing for you, Margaret. Honest work, roof over your head, far away from all the painful memories here in Cedar Falls. The other men at the table were chuckling now, seeing where this was headed. Margaret stood frozen, her mind working quickly. She knew what they were doing. This wasn't concern or helpfulness. This was another form of mockery, another way to humiliate her. I'll tell you what, James said, his voice taking on the tone of someone proposing a grand idea. I'll make a wager right here and now. He pulled out his wallet and slapped a $50 bill on the table. I bet that if Margaret here goes to work for this Brennan fellow, she'll be back within a month, tail between her legs. 'Cause if she couldn't keep a good man like our brother happy, she certainly won't last long trying to keep house for some rough rancher in the middle of nowhere. William immediately matched the bet, throwing his own money on the table. I'll take that wager, but I'll raise you one better. I bet she doesn't even make it a month. 2 weeks, maximum, before she comes running back to her little room above the store. Pete and the other men were laughing openly now, adding their own bills to the growing pile. What happens if she somehow stays longer? Pete asked, clearly thinking this was impossible. James grinned. If by some miracle Margaret Sullivan stays on at that ranch for more than a month, or if she comes back with any prospects of marriage or family, he paused for effect, which we all know is about as likely as snow in July, then we each donate our $50 to the church. Reverend Matthews can use it for his roof fund. The men shook on it, their laughter filling the saloon. They were treating her life like a game, like entertainment for their evening of drinking. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar hurt mixing with something new, something harder. Anger. Real burning anger. She'd spent 3 years trying to be invisible, trying not to make waves, trying to accept the judgment and pity and scorn as if she deserved it. She'd let these people make her feel small and broken and worthless. She'd believed on some level that maybe they were right about her. But standing there in that saloon, watching these men laugh and bet money on her failure, something inside Margaret rebelled. She was tired. Tired of being the object of gossip and pity. Tired of living in a town where everyone knew her worst pain and wouldn't let her forget it. Tired of making herself smaller and quieter in hopes that people would eventually leave her alone. What did she have to lose? Her reputation was already destroyed. Her life in Cedar Falls was already as small and constrained as it could be. These men expected her to fail, expected her to be too weak, too broken, too damaged to do anything but accept their scorn. She could prove them wrong. Or she could fail spectacularly, but at least she'd fail on her own terms, away from their watching eyes and cruel laughter. Margaret took a deep breath and walked over to the table. The men looked up at her, surprised that she hadn't fled. James raised his eyebrows mockingly. Something you want to say, Margaret? I'll take the job, she said clearly, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll go work for Mr. Brennan. For a moment, there was silence. Then William burst out laughing. You serious? You'd actually go out to that godforsaken ranch in the middle of nowhere just because of what we said? Margaret met his eyes directly. I'm going because I choose to. Because anything is better than spending another day in this town listening to people like you decide my worth. She looked around the table at each man in turn. You want to make me into a spectacle? You want to bet on whether I can survive? Fine. But don't expect me to fail just because you think I should. She turned and walked toward the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Behind her, she heard James call out, The notice said he wants someone who can start right away. Can you even get out there? It's a 2-hour drive on rough roads. Margaret paused at the door and looked back over her shoulder. I'll manage, she said simply, and walked out into the cool evening air. As soon as she was outside, her legs began to shake. What had she just done? She'd committed to leaving everything she knew, traveling to a remote ranch to work for a man she'd never met, all because of pride and anger and a desperate need to prove something to people who would probably never see her as anything but a failure anyway. She walked quickly back to the store, her mind racing. She'd need to talk to Mr. Henderson, give him notice. She'd need to find out exactly where this ranch was, how to get there. She'd need to pack her few belongings. And she'd need to do it all before her courage failed her, before the reality of what she'd agreed to made her change her mind. Mrs. Chen was sweeping the steps of the boarding house as Margaret passed. The elderly woman took one look at Margaret's face and set down her broom. "What happened, child?" Margaret stopped, and suddenly the whole story came tumbling out. The bet, the cruel laughter, her impulsive decision. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, her dark eyes sharp and knowing. When Margaret finished, she expected Mrs. Chen to tell her she was being foolish, that she should stay in Cedar Falls where at least she had steady work and a roof over her head, but instead the old woman smiled. "Good," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You have been hiding long enough. Maybe this rancher is terrible, maybe the work is too hard, maybe you come back in 2 weeks. But maybe not. Maybe you find something better out there, something these small-minded people cannot even imagine." She reached out and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You are stronger than you think. Go. See what life has waiting for you." That night, Margaret lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the town around her. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for a journey into the unknown. She was terrified, but underneath the fear was something else, something she hadn't felt in years. The journey to Samuel Brennan's ranch took Margaret longer than she'd expected. Mr. Henderson had kindly arranged for his nephew, a young man named Danny who made supply runs to the remote homesteads, to drive her out in his old truck. They'd left Cedar Falls just after dawn, and now, 3 hours later, they were still bouncing along a narrow dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into the wilderness. Margaret clutched her single battered suitcase on her lap, watching the landscape change around her. They'd left behind the familiar pine forests and rolling hills near town, climbing higher into rougher country. The road, barely more than 2 ruts carved into the earth, twisted through rocky outcrops and sparse grassland. Occasionally they'd pass a weathered fence post or a distant cattle herd, but mostly there was just endless sky and wild country stretching in every direction. "You sure about this, Miss Sullivan?" Danny asked for the 3rd time, his young face creased with concern. "It's mighty isolated out here. Mr. Brennan doesn't come to town more than once or twice a year. If things don't work out, it's not like you can just walk back." Margaret appreciated his worry, but she'd made her decision. "I'm sure, Danny. Thank you for your concern." They drove in silence for another 20 minutes before Danny pointed ahead. "There, that's Brennan's place." The ranch sat in a shallow valley, sheltered by low hills on 3 sides. It was larger than Margaret had expected. A sturdy 2-story house with a deep porch, a big barn painted faded red, several outbuildings and extensive corrals. Cattle dotted the hillsides in the distance. Everything looked well-maintained but worn, as if it had been built with care years ago and had been holding steady ever since without much attention to appearances. As Danny's truck rattled up the long drive, Margaret saw a man emerge from the barn. He was tall and lean, wearing work clothes dusty from labor. Even from a distance, she could see the wariness in his posture as he watched them approach. Danny pulled up near the house and cut the engine. Sudden silence was startling after hours of the truck's rumble. Margaret climbed out, her legs stiff from the journey, and got her first good look at Samuel Brennan. He was probably in his early 40s, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and a weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors. His eyes were a striking blue-gray, and they studied Margaret with an intensity that made her nervous. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't hostile either, just cautious, measuring, taking in every detail. "Mr. Brennan?" Margaret said, finding her voice. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. I'm here about the housekeeper position." Samuel nodded slowly, still not speaking. He glanced at Danny, who gave a little wave. "I'll be heading back now, Miss Sullivan. Good luck to you." The young man clearly wanted to be on his way before dark caught him on those rough roads. "Wait," Samuel said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. "You're staying? You understand what you're signing up for? There's no other women out here for miles. No neighbors close by. It's hard work and lonely work." Margaret lifted her chin. "I understand. That's why I came." Something flickered in Samuel's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. He studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "All right, then. Danny, you can go. I'll take care of her luggage." After Danny's truck disappeared down the long drive, trailing dust, Samuel picked up Margaret's suitcase as if it weighed nothing. "I'll show you to your room. House needs a lot of work. I won't lie to you about that. I've been managing on my own, and I'm better with cattle than cooking and cleaning." He led her onto the porch and through the front door. The house was dim inside, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. As Margaret's eyes adjusted, She could see that Samuel hadn't exaggerated. Dust covered every surface. Dishes were piled in the kitchen sink. The floors needed sweeping badly, but the house itself was solid and spacious with good bones underneath the neglect. Samuel carried her suitcase upstairs to a small bedroom at the back of the house. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the hills. This was... He paused, something painful crossing his face. This was my wife's sewing room. You can make it your own. Thank you, Margaret said softly. It's fine. Samuel stood awkwardly in the doorway. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Sullivan. I need help with the house, but I'm not an easy man to live with. I keep to myself, work long days, don't talk much. If you're expecting conversation or company, you won't find much of it here. That suits me fine, Mr. Brennan. I'm not looking for conversation. I'm looking for honest work, and a place where people don't know my history. He nodded, seeming to appreciate her directness. Fair enough. I'll leave you to settle in. Come down when you're ready, and I'll show you around, explained the routine. After he left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her heart still pounding from the strangeness of it all. She'd done it. She'd actually left Cedar Falls, left behind everything familiar, and come to this remote place to work for a man who was essentially a stranger. Oh, for a moment, doubt crept in. What if she'd made a terrible mistake? What if she couldn't manage out here? But then she thought of James and William laughing in the saloon, betting on her failure, and her resolve hardened. She'd manage. She had to. Margaret unpacked her few belongings, then went downstairs to find Samuel. He was in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee. She watched him struggle with the stove for a moment before stepping forward. May I? She asked. He stepped aside gratefully, and Margaret took over, finding everything she needed despite the disorganization. Within minutes, she had coffee brewing and had begun assessing what needed to be done. The kitchen alone would take days to sort out properly. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. You're quick, he observed. Efficient. I worked in a general store for 3 years, Margaret replied, wiping down the counter. You learned to stay organized. Before that? Margaret's hands paused for just a moment. I was married. My husband died in a logging accident. I'm sorry, Samuel said, and he sounded like he meant it. My wife died 2 years ago. Influenza. It went through her fast. 1 week she was fine. The next she was gone. They stood in silence for a moment. Two people bound by loss, and Margaret felt an unexpected kinship with this quiet, guarded man. Then she heard it. A small sound, like a footstep, coming from somewhere above them. Margaret looked up at the ceiling, then at Samuel. His expression had gone very still, very careful. What was that? She asked. Samuel's jaw tightened. He seemed to be wrestling with something, some decision he didn't want to make. Finally, he let out a long breath. There's something I need to show you. Something I need to tell you. But first, I need you to promise me something. Margaret's heart began to race. What kind of promise? Promise me you'll hear the whole story before you judge. Promise me you'll keep what I'm about to show you a secret, no matter what you decide to do afterward. The intensity in his eyes frightened her a little, but also intrigued her. What secret could be so important? I promise, she said. Samuel nodded, then walked to the base of the stairs. Thomas, he called up. You can come down now. It's all right. Margaret heard soft footsteps on the stairs, and then a small face appeared around the corner. A boy, perhaps, 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair and enormous brown eyes that looked terrified. He was thin, dressed in clothes that were slightly too small, and he held himself with the wariness of a wild animal ready to bolt. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A child. Samuel Brennan had a child, living here in this house, hidden away. Why? Samuel knelt down as the boy reached the bottom of the stairs. Thomas, this is Mrs. Sullivan. She's going to be staying here helping with the house. You don't need to hide from her. The boy looked at Margaret with those huge, frightened eyes, and Margaret felt her heart break a little. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who'd learned that the world wasn't safe, that people couldn't be trusted. She knelt down too, making herself smaller, less threatening. Hello, Thomas, she said gently. I'm very pleased to meet you. The boy didn't respond, just pressed closer to Samuel's side. Samuel put a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. Give him time, he said to Margaret. He's not used to strangers. Margaret stood slowly, her mind whirling with questions. Samuel seemed to read her confusion. Let me make us that coffee, he said. Thomas, why don't you go play in your room for a bit? I need to talk to Mrs. Sullivan. The boy nodded and scampered back upstairs, moving as quietly as a mouse. Once he was gone, Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for Margaret to sit at the kitchen table. "Thomas is my stepson," Samuel began, his voice low. "My wife, Catherine. She was a widow when I met her. Thomas was 3 years old then, her son from her first marriage. His father had died of pneumonia, and Catherine was struggling to make ends meet. We married, and I promised her I'd raise Thomas as my own. And I have. I love that boy like he came from my own blood." "Then why is he hiding?" Margaret asked. "Why did you act like he wasn't here?" Samuel's face darkened with anger, but not at her, because 6 months after Catherine died, a man came from the county office, some kind of social inspector. He'd heard that a single man was trying to raise a child alone out here. He said it wasn't proper, that a boy needed a mother, that I couldn't possibly care for him adequately by myself. He threatened to take Thomas to an orphanage in the city. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "No, I couldn't let that happen," Samuel continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd promised Catherine I'd protect him. And Thomas, he's been through so much already, losing both his fathers, losing his mother. Sending him to an orphanage would destroy him. So I lied. I told the inspector that Thomas had gone to live with Catherine's sister back east. I forged some letters. I did whatever I had to do." "And Thomas has been hiding here ever since?" Margaret asked, her heart aching for the child. "I keep him away from the windows when anyone comes by. I do all the shopping in town myself, so no one knows he's here. He's smart, that boy. He understands why it has to be this way. But it's no life for a child. Always hiding, always afraid." He looked at Margaret with desperate intensity. "That's why I advertised for a housekeeper. I thought if there was a woman here, someone who could care for Thomas properly, maybe I could prove to the authorities that he's being raised right. But I couldn't put that in the advertisement, couldn't risk anyone knowing the truth." Margaret sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by what she'd learned. This quiet, reserved man was protecting his stepson the only way he knew how, at great risk to himself. If anyone discovered what he was doing, he could face serious legal trouble. And yet he'd trusted her with his secret after knowing her for less than an hour. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I could turn you in." Samuel met her eyes steadily. "I could tell from the way you looked at Thomas. You didn't see a problem to be solved or a rule that was broken. You saw a scared child who needed kindness. That told me everything I needed to know about you." He paused. "And I'm gambling that whatever brought you out here to the middle of nowhere, whatever you're running from in your own life, you understand what it means to be judged unfairly." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. He was right. She did understand. She understood what it meant to be seen as less than, to be blamed for circumstances beyond your control, to be denied the very thing your heart wanted most. She thought of the years of whispers, the cruel words, the constant reminder that she was somehow defective because she couldn't bear children. And now here was a child who needed a mother, and a man who needed help protecting him. Maybe this was why she'd come here. Maybe this was the purpose she'd been searching for without even knowing it. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over Samuel's. "I'll help you," she said firmly. "I'll keep your secret, and I'll help you protect Thomas. You have my word." The relief that flooded Samuel's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You don't know what this means." But Margaret thought maybe she did. It meant a second chance. For all of them. The first weeks at the ranch were harder than Margaret had expected, but not in the ways she'd imagined. The physical work didn't bother her. She was used to long days on her feet from the general store. The isolation didn't frighten her either. What challenged her most was watching Thomas struggle with trust, seeing the way he flinched at sudden movements and how he'd disappear into silence for hours at a time. Margaret approached the boy the way she might approach a frightened animal, with patience and consistency. Every morning she made breakfast and set a place for him at the table. Sometimes he'd come down and eat quietly, never meeting her eyes. Other times he'd stay in his room, and she'd leave a plate outside his door. She never forced him, never demanded anything from him. She just showed up, day after day, steady and gentle. She discovered that Thomas loved books. Samuel had a small collection, mostly practical volumes about ranching and animal husbandry, but there were a few storybooks that had belonged to Catherine. Margaret found Thomas one afternoon curled up in the corner of his room, carefully turning the pages of a worn copy of fairy tales, his lips moving silently as he tried to make out the words, "Would you like me to read to you?" Margaret asked softly from the doorway. Thomas looked up, startled, clutching the book to his chest. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, but then he gave the smallest nod. Margaret sat on the floor, keeping some distance between them, and held out her hand for the book. Thomas hesitated, then slowly brought it to her before retreating to his corner. Margaret opened to the first story and began to read aloud. Her voice filled the quiet room, bringing to life tales of brave princes and clever peasants and magical transformations. She read for an hour that first day. Thomas never came closer, but she could see him listening, his whole body focused on her words. When she finished the story and closed the book, he whispered, "Thank you." It became their routine. Every afternoon after Margaret finished her work in the house, she'd find Thomas and read to him. Slowly, over days and then weeks, he began to relax around her. He started coming closer as she read, until one day he was sitting right beside her, his thin shoulder just barely touching her arm. Margaret's heart had swelled so full she thought it might burst. Emil watched these developments with cautious hope. He'd been raising Thomas alone for 2 years, doing his best, but knowing the boy needed more than he could give. Seeing Margaret with Thomas, seeing the careful way she was building trust, something in Samuel's expression began to soften too. The three of them fell into a rhythm. Samuel worked the ranch from dawn until dusk, tending cattle, mending fences, managing the endless tasks that came with running a place this size. Margaret transformed the house, cleaning and organizing, cooking proper meals, making curtains for the windows, and Thomas, slowly, began to emerge from his shell of fear. One evening in late October, Margaret was making dinner when Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Can I help?" he asked quietly. It was the first time he'd initiated any interaction with her. Margaret smiled warmly. "Of course. Would you like to help me make biscuits?" She pulled up a chair so he could reach the counter and showed him how to measure flour, how to cut in the butter, how to knead the dough, just enough but not too much. Thomas's small hands worked carefully, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. When they put the biscuits in the oven, Margaret reached out without thinking and smoothed his dark hair back from his forehead. Thomas froze for just a second, then leaned into her touch, and Margaret had to blink back tears. She'd spent 5 years of marriage desperately wanting to do something as simple as this, to touch a child's hair, to guide small hands in a kitchen, to feel needed and maternal. And now here it was, this unexpected gift in the middle of nowhere. When Samuel came in for dinner that night, dusty and tired from a day of hard work, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. Margaret and Thomas were setting the table together, Thomas chattering about the biscuits they'd made, his face more animated than Samuel had seen in months. Samuel caught Margaret's eye over the boy's head, and the gratitude in his look was unmistakable. They ate together that night, the three of them, and for the first time it felt like a family. Not the family any of them had lost, but something new, something they were building together from the broken pieces of their separate griefs. As autumn deepened into early winter, Margaret found herself happier than she'd been in years. She woke each morning with purpose, knowing she was needed here. Thomas had started calling her Miss Maggie, and would seek her out throughout the day to show her interesting rocks he'd found, or to ask her questions about the stories they read together. She was teaching him to read properly, and his quick mind soaked up everything she showed him. Samuel had grown more comfortable around her, too. He'd started lingering after dinner, talking about the ranch, asking her opinion on things, sharing stories about his life before tragedy had isolated him. Margaret learned that he'd grown up in Wyoming, that he'd bought this ranch with money saved from years of working other men's cattle, that he'd met Catherine at a church social and known within a week that he wanted to marry her. "She was sunshine," Samuel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the hills. Thomas was inside, already asleep. Everything about her was warm and bright. When she died, it was like someone blew out all the lights in the world. "I understand," Margaret said softly. "When Robert died, I thought I'd never feel anything but grief and guilt again." Samuel turned to look at her. Guilt? Why guilt? Margaret had never told anyone the whole truth, but here in the growing darkness, with this man who trusted her with his deepest secret, the words came tumbling out. She told him about the years of trying to conceive, about the blame she'd endured, about the way she'd wondered if Robert's unhappiness had somehow contributed to his carelessness the day he died. She told him about the cruel whispers and the loneliness and the way she'd started to believe that maybe there really was something fundamentally wrong with her. Samuel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The only thing wrong was the people around you. You're one of the strongest, kindest people I've ever met, Margaret. What you've done for Thomas, what you've done for this place, for me, you've brought life back into this house. That takes a special kind of person." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. "You've given me a gift too, you know. A purpose. A place where I can be useful." Their eyes met in the fading light, and something shifted between them. Something tentative and fragile, but real. Samuel reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. They sat like that until the stars came out, not speaking, just being together in comfortable silence. But their peace was shattered 3 days before Christmas. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Samuel burst through the door, his face pale beneath his tan. "There's a government inspector coming," he said urgently. "I was in town picking up supplies and I heard talk at the post office. They're doing some kind of rural homestead survey, checking on isolated farms and ranches. They'll be here within the week." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Thomas, I know," Samuel said, running his hand through his hair in agitation. "If they find him here, if they discover I lied about sending him east, they'll take him away, and they might charge me with fraud or worse." Thomas had appeared at the top of the stairs, his face frightened. He'd heard everything. Margaret's heart broke seeing the terror in his eyes. This child who'd just started to feel safe, who'd just started to trust that maybe the world wasn't such a dangerous place after all. Margaret's mind raced. They could try to hide Thomas during the inspection, but that seemed risky. The inspector might search thoroughly, might notice signs of a child living there. They could send Thomas away temporarily, but where? And how traumatic would that be for him after he just started feeling secure? And an idea struck her, wild and desperate, but possibly their only chance. She looked at Samuel, then at Thomas, then back at Samuel. "Marry me," she said. Samuel stared at her. "What?" Margaret spoke quickly, her thoughts crystallizing as she talked. "We get married? Right away." "Then Thomas isn't a boy being raised by a single man anymore. He's a boy being raised by a married couple. We tell the inspector that Thomas is our son, that we've been married longer than we actually have. We say we kept it quiet because we wanted privacy, because we're private people." "They'll never believe it," Samuel protested, but she could see he was considering it, turning it over in his mind. "Why not?" Margaret countered. "We're both widowed, both been alone, both needed companionship. It makes perfect sense that we'd marry. And if they ask Thomas, he'll tell them we're his parents. Won't you, Thomas?" The boy nodded vigorously, coming down the stairs. "I'll say Miss Maggie is my mama. I'll say it to anyone." Samuel looked between them, and Margaret could see the war of emotions on his face. Hope, fear, doubt, desperation. "Margaret, I can't ask you to do this. To tie yourself to me legally just to protect Thomas. It's too much." "You're not asking," Margaret said firmly. "I'm offering, and it's not just for Thomas, Samuel. It's for all of us." She took a deep breath, making herself vulnerable. "I care about you. I care about Thomas. You've both given me something I thought I'd never have. A family, a home, a purpose. Let me protect that. Let me protect all of us." Samuel stepped closer to her, searching her face. "You're sure? This is what you want?" Margaret thought about Cedar Falls, about James and William and their cruel bet. She thought about the years of loneliness and shame. And then she thought about reading stories to Thomas, about the warmth of Samuel's hand in hers on the porch, about the way she'd started thinking of this remote ranch as home. "I'm sure," she said. Samuel pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight, and Margaret felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for years finally begin to relax. Over Samuel's shoulder, she saw Thomas watching them, and the boy's face was lit with joy. They married 2 days later in a quiet ceremony in a small town 3 hours away, far enough from Cedar Falls that word wouldn't travel quickly. The justice of the peace who performed the ceremony was matter-of-fact about the whole thing, asking no questions about their unusual haste. They signed the papers. Samuel slipped a simple gold band on Margaret's finger, and just like that, she had a new last name and a new life. On the way home, with Thomas squeezed between them on the truck's bench seat, chattering excitedly about having a real family now, Margaret caught Samuel's eye. He smiled at her, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face, and Margaret smiled back. She'd come to this ranch expecting to prove something to cruel men in a saloon. Instead, she'd found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found love in all its unexpected forms. Now they just had to hope their desperate gamble would work when the inspector arrived. The inspector arrived on a cold January morning when frost still clung to the grass, and their breath made clouds in the air. Margaret had spent the previous days preparing not just the house but herself. She'd coached Thomas gently, reminding him that when the man came he should call her Mama and Samuel Papa, just like always. The boy had nodded solemnly, understanding that this was important, that their family depended on him being brave. Samuel had ridden into the distant town the day before to file their marriage certificate with the county clerk, making sure there was an official record. They'd backdated their story, claiming they'd married quietly 6 months ago. It was a dangerous lie, but a necessary one. When the black Ford rolled up the drive, Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and took a deep breath. Samuel came out of the barn, and Thomas stood close to Margaret's side on the porch. She rested her hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt completely natural now. The inspector was a thin man in his 50s, wearing a dark suit that seemed impractical for ranch country. He carried a leather briefcase and had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much hardship in his line of work. His name was Mr. Blundy's Carver, and he introduced himself with professional politeness. Mr. And Mrs. Brennan, he said, tipping his hat. I'm here as part of the Rural Homestead Survey. Just need to ask a few questions, take a look around, make sure everything is in order. Won't take long. Of course, Samuel said, his voice steady. Please, come inside. My wife just made fresh coffee. They settled around the kitchen table, and Margaret poured coffee while Thomas sat quietly, his homework spread before him. Margaret had made sure he'd be doing schoolwork when the inspector arrived, proof that he was being properly educated. Mr. Carver pulled out a sheaf of papers. How long have you folks been living here? I've owned the ranch for 8 years, Samuel replied. Margaret and I married last summer. She moved here in October. And the boy? Mr. Carver's eyes shifted to Thomas. Our son, Margaret said, her voice warm and natural. She'd practiced this moment in her mind 100 times. Thomas is 7. He's my son from my first marriage. My husband passed away when Thomas was small, and Samuel has been wonderful about taking him in as his own. It was close enough to the truth that it didn't feel entirely like a lie. Thomas was her son now, in every way that mattered, and Samuel had taken him as his own. Mr. Carver made notes. The boy's being educated. I teach him myself, Margaret said. I was a schoolteacher's daughter, and I worked in town for several years. Thomas is reading at an advanced level and doing arithmetic well beyond his age. Show me, Mr. Carver said to Thomas directly. Thomas looked up at the inspector with those big brown eyes, and Margaret held her breath. This was the moment that mattered most. Thomas picked up his book and began to read aloud, his voice clear and confident. He read a full page without stumbling, then set the book down. Very good, Mr. Carver said, sounding genuinely impressed. And you're happy here, son? You have what you need? Thomas glanced at Margaret, then at Samuel, and his face broke into a genuine smile. Yes, sir. I have my mama and my papa, and we have books and good food, and Papa is teaching me about the ranch. I'm real happy here. The simple honesty in the boy's voice seemed to affect Mr. Carver. His expression softened slightly. I see. Well, that's good to hear. He asked to tour the house, and Margaret showed him around with pride. She'd worked hard to make it a proper home, and it showed. The rooms were clean and organized, there were curtains at every window, and Thomas's bedroom was cozy and filled with evidence of a child being loved, drawings pinned to the walls, books stacked neatly on a shelf, a quilt Margaret had mended spread across his bed. You keep a good home, Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Mernon, Carver observed. Thank you, Margaret replied. It's important to me that Thomas grows up in a place that feels safe and warm. He's lost so much already. His father, then the upheaval of moving here. Samuel and I want to give him stability. Mr. Carver nodded, making more notes. They returned to the kitchen, where Samuel had been waiting, his tension barely visible. The inspector asked a few more questions about the ranch's productivity, about their plans for the future, about their financial stability. Samuel answered each question confidently, showing records of cattle sales and land management. Finally, Mr. Carver closed his folder and stood. Everything seems to be in order here. The boy is clearly well cared for, the home is suitable, and you're both capable guardians. I'll file my report as satisfactory. The relief that flooded through Margaret was so intense she felt momentarily dizzy. Samuel shook the inspector's hand firmly. Thank you for your time, Mr. Carver. As they walked the inspector to his car, Mr. Carver paused and looked back at the house, then at Thomas, who was watching from the porch. You know, he said quietly, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen a lot of children in situations that broke my heart. Neglected, unwanted, treated like burdens. That boy in there, he's loved. Anyone can see it. You're doing right by him. After the inspector's car disappeared down the drive, Samuel pulled Margaret into his arms right there in the yard, holding her tight. Thomas ran down from the porch and wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stood there together, a family that had almost been torn apart but had held together through courage and quick thinking. That night, after Thomas was asleep, Samuel and Margaret sat by the fire in the living room. The tension of the past weeks had finally eased, and they could breathe again. We did it, Samuel said softly. We actually did it. Margaret leaned against his shoulder. Thomas did it. He was so brave. He loves you, Samuel said. The way he looks at you, the way he lights up when you're in the room. Margaret, You've given him something I couldn't give him on my own. You've given him a mother." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "He's given me something, too. Something I thought I'd never have." Samuel turned to face her, his hand cupping her cheek. "I know we married for practical reasons, to protect Thomas. But, Margaret, somewhere along the way, this became real for me. You became real for me. I'm falling in love with you." Margaret's heart swelled. "I'm already there," she whispered. "I love you, Samuel. I love Thomas. I love this life we're building together." He kissed her then, gentle and tender, and Margaret kissed him back, pouring into it all the hope and joy and gratitude she felt. They'd found each other in the strangest way, brought together by circumstances neither of them would have chosen. But somehow, from loss and loneliness and desperation, they'd created something beautiful. The months passed, and winter gave way to spring. The ranch flourished under Samuel's capable management and Margaret's organizational skills. Thomas grew taller and more confident, thriving under the love and attention of two parents who adored him. He no longer flinched at sudden movements or hid when strangers came by. He was becoming the boy he was always meant to be, happy, curious, secure. In late April, Margaret received a letter from Mrs. Chen. Her old friend wrote that news had reached Cedar Falls about Margaret's marriage and her sudden appearance with a son. The town was buzzing with speculation and gossip. James and William Sullivan, Mrs. Chen reported with obvious satisfaction, had been forced to make good on their bet. They'd each donated $50 to the church, and the humiliation of it had been widely enjoyed by everyone who'd witnessed their cruel wager that night in the saloon. But more than that, Mrs. Chen wrote, people were reconsidering the things they'd said about Margaret. If she could build a good life for herself, if she could become a mother after all, then maybe their judgment had been wrong. Maybe the fault had never been with Margaret at all. Margaret read the letter aloud to Samuel as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. When she finished, he took her hand. "Do you want to go back? Let them see what you've built here?" Margaret considered it. Part of her wanted to return to Cedar Falls in triumph, to show everyone who'd pitied and blamed her that she'd found happiness despite their cruelty. But a larger part of her realized that she didn't need their validation anymore. She'd found something more important than revenge or vindication. "No," she said finally. "My life isn't in Cedar Falls anymore. It's here, with you and Thomas. Let them think what they want. I know the truth." Samuel squeezed her hand. "What truth is that?" Margaret smiled, watching Thomas play with the ranch dogs in the yard, his laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "That family isn't always about blood or biology. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to love you, who show up for you, who build a life with you piece by piece. That's what we have. That's what we are." In June, Samuel suggested they travel to Cedar Falls for the summer festival. Margaret was surprised. She'd told him she had no desire to return. But Samuel had a different reason. "I think we should go," he said. "Not to prove anything to them, but to let Thomas see where you came from. And maybe to show them that their cruelty didn't break you. It led you to something better." So they made the journey, the three of them, in Samuel's truck. When they rolled into Cedar Falls on a warm Saturday afternoon, heads turned immediately. Margaret climbed out of the truck holding Thomas's hand, and Samuel stood beside her, solid and supportive. The festival was in full swing in the town square. Margaret saw familiar faces everywhere, people she'd known her whole life, people who'd whispered about her, people who'd watched her grief and loneliness with judgment rather than compassion. James and William Sullivan stood near the lemonade stand, and when they saw Margaret, their expressions were priceless. Shock, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment crossed their faces. Margaret walked toward them, her head high, her family beside her. "Hello, James." "William," she said calmly. "Margaret," James managed. His eyes darted to Thomas, to Samuel, then back to her. "We heard you'd married." "Yes. This is my husband Samuel and our son Thomas." She emphasized the words slightly, watching understanding dawn on their faces. William cleared his throat. "Well, good for you, I suppose." "It is good," Margaret agreed. "Very good. I have a home, a family, a life full of purpose and love. Everything I was told I could never have." She paused, then added softly, "No thanks to either of you." She didn't wait for their response. She simply turned and walked away, Samuel and Thomas beside her. She heard Mrs. Chen calling her name and saw her old friend hurrying toward them with tears in her eyes. They embraced, and Mrs. Chen made a tremendous fuss over Thomas, declaring him the most handsome and clever boy she'd ever met. They spent the afternoon at the festival, and Margaret introduced Samuel and Thomas to the few people in Cedar Falls who'd shown her kindness during her darkest days. She avoided most of the others, having no interest in their belated attempts at friendliness now that she'd returned with visible proof of happiness. As the sun began to set and they prepared to make the long drive home, Mr. Henderson found them. The old man who'd given Margaret work when she'd needed it most shook Samuel's hand and pressed a small package into Margaret's hands. "For the boy," he said gruffly. "Some candy and a few books. You take care of that family of yours, Margaret. You earned it." On the drive home, with Thomas asleep between them, his head on Margaret's lap, Samuel asked, "How do you feel?" "About going back, seeing them all?" Margaret thought about it. She'd expected to feel triumphant or vindicated, but instead she just felt peaceful. "I feel grateful," she said finally. "Grateful that their cruelty pushed me to leave. Grateful that I had the courage to take that job. Grateful for every step that led me to you and Thomas." "Even the hard parts?" Samuel asked. "Even losing Robert? Even the years of judgment? Even those?" Margaret said. "Because they made me who I am. They taught me that my worth isn't defined by other people's opinions or expectations. They taught me to be brave." Samuel reached over and took her hand. "You're the bravest person I know." Margaret looked down at Thomas, sleeping peacefully, his small hand clutching her sleeve even in sleep. This boy who'd been hidden away, who'd been told he was a secret to be kept, was now her son in every way that mattered. And Samuel, this quiet man who'd risked everything to protect a child, was her partner, her love, her home. They'd all been broken in different ways. They'd all lost people they loved. They'd all faced judgment and fear and uncertainty. But together they'd built something whole and beautiful from those broken pieces. As they drove through the night toward the ranch, toward the life they'd created together, Margaret understood something profound. The men in that saloon had meant to humiliate her with their bet. They'd sent her away, expecting her to fail, expecting her to come crawling back defeated and alone. Instead, she'd come back with a son, a husband, and a future full of promise. She'd come back with everything they'd said she could never have, not because she'd proven them wrong, but because she'd stopped letting their judgment define her worth. The bet had been cruel, but in a strange way it had been a gift. It had pushed her out of her small, constrained life and into something bigger, something truer. Something that belonged entirely to her. She was Margaret Brennan now, mother and wife and partner. She was home, and that was worth more than any amount of vindication or revenge could ever be.